Welcome to Apologia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. For the sake of discussion, I'm generally willing to grant that the stories that arose about Jesus are based on an actual person, so that we can get to the more interesting parts.
Specifically, Paul's letters and the Synoptic Gospels are considered to be valid historical documents.
Well, that depends entirely on what you mean by valid historical documents. First, only 7 of the 13 letters traditionally attributed to Paul are broadly considered to be authentic. These are the so-called undisputed letters of Paul. The rest aren't treated as valid historical documents outside of the most fundamentalist of believers. And as for the Gospels, while secular historians might agree that they contain historical details, like the names of towns or government officials, they generally agree that the Gospels are theological or apologetical works rather than historical. Naturally, the fundamentalist Christian followers disagree, but for this video to declare them valid historical documents gives entirely the wrong impression. If you're taking the Gospels at face value, then this video could have been 2 minutes long. Gary Habermas admits that the Gospels are not the historically accepted books. When he makes this comment, it's about the undisputed letters of Paul, not the Gospels.
And you go, but there you go again, use the New Testament. Critics use the New Testament. They will use it. If you don't, they will use it. Now here's a skeptic talking. They're going to say, we're not going to let you use those 13 books because we think a lot of them were written by Paul. We'll let you use 6 or 7 of the books. They call these the authentic epistles. It's not wise to sit there and go, no, I want to argue for the books you don't accept. Don't think you're getting your PhD. But what if you just take the data they give you? And what are they going to give you unanimously? Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. They'll always give you those sources.
So what we have in this time period between Jesus' death and the Gospel of Mark is the development of the oral tradition. The question is, to what extent over those 40 years of oral transmission did the gospel stories expand and grow incrementally, like we know that legends do in far shorter periods of time? The video depicts Christian leaders in Rome writing something down. So the hypothetical being posited is trying to make a change to the established text. That definitely leaves a paper trail. But in the decades before the first written gospel, the proposed harmony and geographical stories about Jesus is entirely hypothetical. The letters of Paul and other early church documents reveal that there were massive disagreements. Who's to say that the details of the verbal stories about Jesus in Africa matched what the Gospels recorded? Perhaps it was vastly different, but the more authoritative written version simply supplanted the earlier regional variations over time. History is silent on this hypothetical agreement. The video references the research of Bart Ehrman on these topics, but ignores Dr. Ehrman's most important observation, that the obvious attempts by Christians to favorably alter the text after it had been widely circulated should make us consider and suspect that this same Christian community would have been equally willing to favorably alter the word-of-mouth stories before they were written down.
It's a story that was added later after our earliest manuscripts. How many stories were added before our earliest manuscripts? We have no way of knowing. They may have been some of our favorite stories. How would we know? We can't know. We don't have any evidence.
If you've never had the 4 Gospels open at the same time and read through verse by verse to observe the differences in each telling, I would highly recommend you take it on as an exercise. Or maybe check the description for a link to my blog entry where I did this exact thing while I was still a Christian believer. It's pretty shocking the first time you see it. The infographic video focuses on one such discrepancy, the number of women involved. Of course, it's a relatively easy harmonization rationalization to make. The process of harmonization involves imagining scenarios where seemingly contradicting details can be technically correct at the same time. This is easier in some instances than others.
In Matthew's gospel, they leave Jerusalem right away to go to Galilee. That's where they meet Jesus. And in Luke, they do not leave Jerusalem ever until until long after his ascension. So which is it? You can't say, well, they stayed in Jerusalem, then they left for a few days and came back. No, they're told to stay, and they stay. Or do they go to Galilee? My point is, they say opposite things. So they both cannot be historically reliable. Okay? You can do this 100 times in the Gospels. And at a point, you just start saying, you know, maybe there are some differences that can't be reconciled. And if you can't reconcile the differences, they can't be all historically reliable. And maybe that doesn't matter to you, which is fine. I mean, if it doesn't matter to you, it's fine. But you shouldn't say then that every word in here is accurate, because it's not.
How much differing details will bother you will vary from person to person. In fact, some embrace it. As for me, I'm less bothered by the ways the gospel differ than the obvious ways they are identical. If the documents are perfectly accurate to each other, they've been collaborated, and their value as historical documents are seriously damaged. Well, it just so happens that the synoptic gospels are massively reliant on each other in this way. Over 90% of Mark was copied into Matthew and Luke, generally word for word in the original Greek, and a quarter of Matthew and Luke overlap each other. In a court of law, we call this collusion. These are not independent stories that can corroborate each other. Rather, they are works of plagiarism, with some tweaks for differing theological emphasis. Of course, any account over any amount of time can be accurate, but the longer the time gap between the event and the recording, the more opportunities there are for inaccuracies to creep in. Some posit that there may have been a Q source, or other Christian writings that might make portions of the Gospels similarly have earlier roots. The problem with that is such a person would then have to admit that the Gospel writers weren't eyewitnesses. And undoubtedly, the longer the time from the event to the record, the less certain the historian is. Historical conclusions are held very tentatively, and the details even less so. General first-century history tells us that Roman crucifixion victims were usually left on the cross to rot in public, fed to wild dogs, and finally tossed into unmarked ditch graves or mass graves. There is evidence for some exceptions in history, but this is the general rule. An unmarked end to the corpse is what usually happened, and should therefore be the default expectation for Jesus. The idea that Jesus might have been placed in a tomb at all is entirely... But I'm unaware of any secular historians who affirm an empty tomb. I agree that the swoon theory isn't particularly compelling, but it continues to live on primarily because the Islamic Quran records that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Historian Gerd Ludemann notes in The Resurrection of Christ, a Historical Inquiry, that Christians in Jerusalem appear to have placed zero emphasis on the location of the tomb until the 4th century, when Constantine's mother went looking for holy sites. Even if there was an empty tomb, that people knew the location is conjecture without evidence. If Jesus' body was thrown into a mass grave, which is the most likely scenario, then there would have been no way to later present Jesus' body, assuming anyone cared enough to do so before it would have decayed beyond recognition anyhow.
It's important to note who discovered the empty tomb as well. Women. In the very patriarchal society of the ancient Jews, women were not regarded as credible witnesses in court.
Infographics is going to appeal to what Christian apologists call the criterion of embarrassment. But this is a principle very rarely used outside of Christian circles, if only for the reason that historians can't know what was or wasn't embarrassing to someone in an ancient time or place. What's embarrassing is largely determined by culture and the individual. In addition, authors may well have motives to invent details that supersede their own aversion to embarrassment. In The Office, Jim pretended to not know how to drive a standard transmission in order to continue having driving lessons with Pam, his love interest. Beyond the general principle, in first-century Jewish culture, it was the job of women to anoint bodies. It would have been an unbelievable detail to invent a story where men arrive first. It's not their job. In addition, the Gospel of Mark is clearly marketing Christianity as a religion for the outcast. According to the book of Acts, women were instrumental in creating converts. The Old Testament constantly emphasized that it was women who steered men away from Yahweh. And general history affirms the female social bonds as a religious force. It doesn't matter to Christianity what the courts would have upheld. It was concerned with spreading en masse. And that meant appealing to the ladies. This embarrassment thing is not an argument that should be compelling to you.
The majority of the New Testament historians affirm that Jesus appeared to his disciples after his death.
No. According to resurrection scholar Dr. Gary Habermas, referenced earlier in the video, what historians affirm is that the disciples believed that they saw Jesus after his death. It's a subtle but very important difference. Historians affirm belief in the event, not the event.
They thought they saw the risen Jesus. The disciples had experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus.
If the historical Jesus was anything like the Bible described, he was full of ideas that countered traditional Jewish beliefs, and followers of such a teacher would also be open to new ideas. I tried to find the research that infographics says medical science used to establish that hallucination cannot create new ideas. The phrasing here is important. A hallucination can't bring you new information per se, but it can certainly bring to the fore thoughts and memories that have been suppressed, or cause you to recombine your existing ideas in new ways. Anything already in your brain is fair game. And the hallucination itself is a new experience that the brain has to rationalize and now incorporate in ways not well predicted. I don't think we can confidently know what historical Jesus taught, but if any of it included predictions of defeating death, then suddenly all the pieces are in place. Many world religions can be traced back to a single person, like the Prophet Muhammad of Islam, Siddhartha Gautama of Buddhism, Joseph Smith of Mormonism, Ron Hubbard of Scientology, and so on. If a single disciple had a hallucination and his enthusiasm caught on, that's all we need to jumpstart the religion. This fits completely with the verifiable data that we have about early Christianity. Grief hallucinations happen in about 15% of people. Is 15% astronomical to the point of absurdity?
Further, it's well recorded that Jesus appeared to groups of the disciples at the same time, and hallucinations cannot be shared between individuals.
That depends entirely on what you mean by well recorded. Paul's letter to the Corinthians refers to an early church recitation with a vague notion, and then a handful of places in the Gospels, some stories are told, possibly to flesh out that basic claim of the creed. But these Gospel accounts don't corroborate each other at all in the details, or even enough to identify the stories as supposedly the same event. Much like the Disney Plus Clone Wars cartoon merely fleshes out this single line from a movie 40 years prior.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
These group resurrection appearances are post hoc tales, not backed up by anything. They're...
Lastly, there's the case of St. Paul. While on the road, Paul encounters Jesus and is blinded.
Hold on a minute there. We have 7 letters from Paul, and in none of them does he describe going blind. As far as we can tell, this is a detail added later by one of the gospel writers. Blindness of Paul is not a historical fact that needs explaining.
In short, Paul would have to have been one of the most mentally ill individuals in history to suffer from all 4 mental disorders simultaneously at exactly this stretch of road on the way to Damascus.
Let's be a little careful here, infographics. Of the 4 things listed here, only conversion disorder is considered to be a neurological order by the DSM-5. Messiah complex is a state of mind, not a diagnosable disorder. Multimodal grief hallucinations, including visual and auditory, happen equally frequently in individuals with no past or predictive indicators of mental illness. Let's not casually and irresponsibly throw around phrases like mentally ill where they are not warranted. And again, conversion disorder is only on screen to explain blindness, which doesn't need to be explained. Who says that whatever Paul experienced was in any way the same as what the earlier disciple experienced? We don't have any first-hand testimony to know about the latter. And Paul's seems to have been just a vision of light. From what we can tell, Peter and Paul were in harmony in some areas, but in conflict on others. We don't know in what category their Jesus interactions fit.
It also cannot explain the post-mortem appearances to entire groups of people as recorded by the disciples, as hallucinations are a personal experience.
We don't have any good evidence for group appearances of risen Jesus. Just some third-hand at best hearsay. I'm actually currently in a written debate with Christian professor Dr. Andrew Loke on this topic that you can check out if you're interested.
Next is the marked change in the disciples' lives as a result of their post-mortem encounters with Jesus.
We have no idea if there was a marked change in the disciples' lives. First, because any hints we have about the disciples' pre-Jesus lives are... Second, most of the disciples disappear from reliable history after Jesus' death. Even if we take the Bible at full face value, we have no idea what happened to them, or if their lives were actually changed. There's reasonable evidence that Peter and John continued. The rest, just legends from centuries later.
Hallucinations simply do not lead to lifelong ideological changes, and the disciples clearly underwent traumatic and unprecedented ideological and theological changes.
There are plenty of conditions that change people's lives and include hallucination as a symptom. Guilt-induced post-traumatic stress is just one, but might be a good candidate for what we know about Paul.
Yet we know that within months of the resurrection, possibly even weeks, the disciples were boldly proclaiming Jesus' resurrection.
We know that Peter was. The rest? No idea. False ideas can spread as quickly as true ideas. Maybe faster. Do people come to believe in Christianity because of solid evidence and rigorous epistemology? What do you think, Dr. William Lane Craig?
I think that the fundamental way in which we know Christianity is true is through the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. I do not think that arguments and evidence are necessary in order for faith to be rational or for you to know that God exists and has revealed himself in Christ. So I would say that the fundamental way we know Christianity is true is through the witness of the Holy Spirit, and reason and argument then can confirm the Spirit's witness.
Most people become Christians because of an inner experience. There's no reason to think that the first few generations of Christianity would need to be any different.
Critics argue that the entire narrative was fabricated by the early church.
There's a huge difference between a legendary tall tale that grew a little with each telling and the idea of being entirely fabricated. An accumulation of exaggerations doesn't require some kind of mastermind plot. And yet, the gospel writers found dozens of Old Testament passages to validate their idea that Jesus was the Messiah. So much so that it seems like some of the stories about Jesus arose specifically to strengthen fulfilled prophecy ideas. So which is it? The brother of Jesus was a political murder. None of our sources point to ideology, nor do we even have any first-hand sources about what James believed or why. This is just speculations.
There's no possible reason to believe that if the disciples were truly con men, they would have stuck to the con all the way up to their own execution. And yet, history records no mention of their recanting their beliefs.
History also records no mention of an opportunity to recant. Peter and Paul were killed under Nero, who was merely blaming Christians for the fire he set. He didn't care if they recanted. As discussed, the death of James and James similarly have no evidence of ideological dispute. There's no reason to think any of these men could have saved themselves by recanting. You could also look at those discrepancies in the gospel accounts of the empty tomb. Each subsequent telling adds more and more supernatural elements, from men in white clothes to glowing angels. Later gospels add even crazier elements, like a talking giant cross. This is the tip of the iceberg.
In fact, the entire account of the life, death, and post-mortem appearances of Jesus is quite embarrassing to the early church.
If your religion appeals to the uneducated and the outcast, you include details about being uneducated and outcast in order to be relatable. And again, only Christian historians regularly presume to know what was or wasn't embarrassing to people 2,000 years ago.
The question of if Jesus rose from the dead or not remains without a plausible naturalistic answer.
The only detail to be explained is that Christianity became popular. Many ideas become popular without a basis in reality. Someone was mistaken is a plausible naturalistic answer to virtually any claim. Someone was mistaken. Mystery solved. Facts explained. See you over there. Later.